Welcome back to US Watch Truth. Tonight at 3:46 in the morning, the most sensitive and most heavily guarded military installation in the entire Middle East ceased to exist as a functional strategic asset. The Negev Nuclear Research Center at Dimona, Israel's most protected and most consequential military facility. The installation whose existence Israel has never officially confirmed and whose destruction every Western strategic planner had classified as a scenario too catastrophic to seriously model, was struck by the opening salvo of what would become a 1,700 missile FATTAH hypersonic attack executed with a speed, a precision, and a structural logic that has left every analyst I have spoken with in the hours since completely unable to find adequate language for what they witnessed. I want you to understand what Dimona represented before I walk you through what happened to it tonight. This was not a military base in any conventional sense. This was the physical foundation of Israel's ultimate strategic deterrent, the hardened, deeply buried, extraordinarily protected installation from which Israel's nuclear program has been sustained, developed, and safeguarded for over 6 decades. Its underground facilities, built at staggering cost over generations, with the most advanced hardening technology available to any Western military engineering program, were designed to survive anything short of a direct nuclear strike. Its layered air defense network, incorporating every advanced interceptor system available to the Israeli military, was designed specifically around the threat of Iranian ballistic missile attack and was assessed by every Western intelligence agency as capable of defeating any Iranian strike package that could realistically be generated. Its redundant power systems, its communications architecture, its physical separation from population centers, and its extraordinary depth of construction were all engineered to make Dimona not just survivable, but indestructible under any conventional attack scenario. Every one of those assessments was wrong. 1,700 FATTAH hypersonic missiles arriving in sequenced waves at speeds that compressed the available intercept timeline to fractions of what Israeli air defense doctrine required for effective engagement did not merely damage Dimona, they destroyed it, completely systematically, and with a finality that has produced a level of strategic shock in Western capitals that I have not seen in my years of covering this region. And in Washington, the response was not a military counter. It was not a carrier deployment. It was not a strike authorization. It was an emergency session convened in the early hours of the morning behind closed doors by an administration that is confronting the most catastrophic single event in the history of the American alliance system and visibly has no answer for it. This is U.S. Watch Truth. What I am about to walk you through tonight is the most consequential strategic analysis I have ever produced on this channel. I need you to stay with me for every word of it. 4 questions are going to drive everything I cover tonight, and I want to lay them out clearly before we go into the analysis, because each one connects to the others in ways that only become fully visible when you see the complete picture that emerges from all 4 together. First, how did 1,700 FATTAH hypersonic missiles penetrate and destroy an installation that Western intelligence had assessed as invulnerable to any conventional Iranian strike package? And what does the operational sequence of the Dimona strike reveal about the true depth of Iranian strategic targeting, intelligence, and hypersonic weapons integration capability that I believe the Western analytical community has been catastrophically underestimating for years? Second, what is the FATTAH hypersonic missile, and why does its specific technical configuration, its speed, its maneuverability, its terminal approach profile make it uniquely and perhaps uniquely lethal against exactly the kind of deeply hardened, multiplied defended strategic installation that Israel spent 6 decades and incalculable resources building at Dimona Third? What drove Washington's decision to convene an emergency session rather than respond with military force? And what does that decision signal to every nation on earth that has structured its security calculations around the assumption that American power stands behind its most important alliance commitments. And fourth, what does the destruction of Dimona and Washington's emergency session response mean for the global nuclear order, the future of American extended deterrence, and the accelerating consolidation of the multipolar world that Iran, Russia, and China have been systematically constructing for over a decade? Every answer is coming in full depth. Stay with me. Before I go any further into tonight's analysis, I need to ask something of everyone watching right now. U.S. Watch Truth exists to deliver the kind of strategic depth that you simply cannot get from mainstream coverage of events of this magnitude. The operational detail, the geopolitical context, the honest assessment of what is actually happening to American power in the world as it exists tonight, rather, than as official narratives describe it. If this channel is providing that value for you, I need you to show it right now. Hit like on this video, immediately subscribe to the channel if you have not already done so. Share this video across every platform and every network you use, and drop your own strategic assessment in the comments below. I read everything my community produces in the comments, and I engage seriously with the analysis you bring to the conversation. The discussion this content generates is as important to me as the content itself. Now let me take you into the full picture of what happened at Dimona at 3:46 this morning. The destruction of Dimona was not the product of numerical force alone, though 1,700 missiles was certainly a volume sufficient to overwhelm any realistic defensive response given the state of Israeli interceptor inventories, and critically, given the nature of the weapon system Iran chose for this strike. What made the Dimona attack operationally decisive in a way that no previous Iranian strike has been was the intersection of two factors that Western threat assessments had modeled separately but never together at operational scale. The first was the hypersonic flight profile of the FATTAH missile system, which compressed the available intercept timeline for Israeli air defense to a fraction of what doctrine required for effective engagement. The second was the extraordinary depth and precision of Iranian targeting intelligence against Dimona's specific physical architecture, intelligence that had clearly been developed over years of sustained collection and that translated directly into an operational strike plan of remarkable sophistication. I want to spend time on the intelligence preparation phase before I walk you through the strike itself, because I think it is the element of tonight's events that reveals the most about the Iranian military establishment we are dealing with, and that has received the least analytical attention in the coverage I have seen. Iranian intelligence collection against Dimona was not a short-term operation mounted in response to the current conflict. It was a sustained, multi-decade, multi-source intelligence effort that drew on satellite imagery at multiple spectral frequencies, signals intelligence intercepts of the communications and electronic emissions associated with Dimona's operations, human intelligence networks with access to technical information about the facility's construction and operational characteristics, and the systematic analysis of publicly available technical literature on deep underground facility design and hardening standards. The synthesis of these sources over years produced a targeting picture of extraordinary resolution, one that mapped not just the surface layout of the facility, but the subsurface architecture of its most sensitive installations, the locations of its ventilation systems and emergency access, infrastructure, the routing of its power and communications, conduits, and the specific depth and reinforcement characteristics of its most hardened elements. That targeting picture was the foundation on which the operational sequence of the Dimona strike was built. And without it, 1,700 missiles would have produced widespread destruction without achieving the systematic defeat of Dimona's layered protection that the strike actually accomplished. The 1,700 FATTAH missiles were organized into 7 distinct strike echelons, each targeting specific elements of the Dimona complex, in a sequence designed to progressively defeat its protection from the outermost defensive layer, inward and downward to its deepest hardened facilities. I want to walk you through each echelon in detail because the operational logic of the sequence is as important as the physical destruction it produced. The first echelon of 140 missiles launched at 3:46 in the morning. I want you to hold that time because the entire subsequent sequence unfolds from it with a precision and a speed that I think is genuinely remarkable, even having studied Iranian military operations extensively. Those 140 missiles targeted the air defense infrastructure, protecting Dimona specifically. The Arrow 3 batteries that formed the outermost intercept layer, the David Sling systems, providing intermediate intercept capability, the Iron Dome batteries, protecting against shorter range threats, and the radar infrastructure, providing the sensor coverage that connected all of these systems into a coherent defensive network. The hypersonic flight profile of the FATTAH missiles compressed the engagement timeline for each of these systems to a fraction of what their operational doctrine assumed would be available, and the volume of simultaneous inbound tracks saturated the fire control capacity of interceptor systems that were already operating with degraded inventories. Within 5 minutes of the first echelon's arrival, Dimona's air defense network had been effectively neutralized. What followed would encounter no meaningful defensive resistance. The second echelon of 220 missiles arrived at 3:54 in the morning and targeted the surface installations of the Dimona complex, the administrative and operational buildings, the security infrastructure, the above-ground technical facilities, and the external power supply systems that fed the installation's operational requirements. These strikes served a dual operational purpose. They destroyed the surface infrastructure that supported Dimona's above-ground functions, and they generated fires and secondary disruptions that degraded the ability of facility personnel to execute the emergency protocols that would normally facilitate transition to underground hardened spaces. The fires burning across Dimona's surface at this point were not incidental consequences of the attack. They were a designed operational element intended to complicate the facility's damage control response and personnel protection during the critical minutes before the deeper echelons arrived. The third echelon of 280 missiles arrived at 4:02 in the morning and represented the first direct assault on the facility's hardened underground infrastructure. These missiles carried earth-penetrating warhead configurations specifically engineered for the defeat of the reinforced concrete and compacted earth intermediate protection layers that shield the upper levels of deeply buried facilities. The warhead design used a tandem configuration, a hardened penetrator nose section, followed by a shaped charge that expanded the penetration channel before the main explosive payload detonated at depth, maximizing both the penetration achieved and the structural damage generated at each impact point. Against the reinforced construction of Dimona's intermediate protection layers, these warheads performed as their designers had engineered them to perform, cracking and collapsing sections of the protective structure and exposing the levels below to the echelons that would follow. The fourth echelon of 260 missiles arrived at 4:09 in the morning, targeting the ventilation and access infrastructure of the underground complex with a precision that speaks directly to the quality of Iranian targeting intelligence about Dimona's specific physical architecture. Iranian planners had identified the locations of Dimona's primary ventilation shafts, its emergency access tunnels, and its utility conduit routing with sufficient accuracy to direct individual missiles against these specific structural elements. The destruction of ventilation infrastructure is not merely a life support attack against personnel sheltering below. It is a structural attack that significantly degrades the ability of a hardened underground complex to withstand the overpressure effects of the large yield detonations that would follow in subsequent echelons. A ventilation compromised underground facility transmits blast energy through its structural elements far more efficiently than one with intact pressure relief pathways. Iranian planners understood this and incorporated it as a deliberate element of the strike sequence. The fifth echelon of 240 missiles arrived at 4:17 in the morning and was the decisive, deep penetration strike against Dimona's most hardened and most sensitive underground facilities. These missiles carried the heaviest and most sophisticated warhead configurations in the entire strike package: tandem deep penetration warheads with delayed action fuse systems calibrated to achieve maximum depth before detonating against the now compromised intermediate protection layers. The penetration depths achieved by these warheads against Dimona's underground infrastructure exceeded the maximum penetration capability that any Western intelligence assessment had attributed to any Iranian conventional munition by a margin that has produced in the hours since the strike a level of genuine technical shock within Western intelligence communities that I have not previously encountered in my coverage of this conflict. The sixth echelon of 220 missiles arrived at 4:24 in the morning, targeting the communications and power infrastructure that connected Dimona's deepest facilities to each other and to the national command authority. The systematic destruction of these conduits did not merely cut the facility's communications, it isolated whatever structural elements remained functional in the deepest levels of the complex from any possibility of coordinated recovery operation or continued operational function. By the time the sixth echelon had completed its work, Dimona was not merely physically destroyed. It was operationally dead, isolated, and unrecoverable within any time frame that could matter to the current conflict. The seventh and final echelon of 140 missiles arrived at 4:31 in the morning to complete the destruction of whatever physical integrity remained across the Dimona complex and to eliminate any possibility that recovery operations could restore any element of the facility's functionality within an operationally relevant time frame. When the last FATTAH of the seventh echelon impacted at 4:34 in the morning, 48 minutes after the first missile of the first echelon had struck Dimona's outermost air defense installations, the most sensitive military installation in the Middle East had been reduced to a field of collapsed tunnels, burning wreckage, and structural rubble that extended across several square kilometers of the Negev desert. Israel's ultimate strategic foundation had been destroyed. The FATTAH hypersonic missile is, in my assessment, the single most consequential weapons system introduced into operational inventory by any military power in the past decade. And the reasons for that assessment go directly to why 1,700 of them were able to accomplish tonight what no previous Iranian strike package had been capable of achieving. I want to explain the FATTAH's technical configuration in enough detail that you understand not just what it did at Dimona, but why it was able to do it against a target defended by the most sophisticated layered air defense network in the Middle East. The FATTAH is a hypersonic glide vehicle ballistic missile system with a demonstrated operational range of approximately 1,400 kilometers, placing all of Israeli territory well within its engagement envelope from launch positions across western and central Iran. It used solid fuel propulsion in its boost phase, providing the same road-mobile launch flexibility and pre-launch concealment advantages that I discussed in the context of the Zulfahar in our previous analysis. But the propulsion system, while important, is not what makes the FATTAH operationally revolutionary. What makes it revolutionary is the hypersonic glide vehicle that it delivers to the upper atmosphere and the flight profile that vehicle executes on its way to the target. After boost phase separation, the FATTAH's hypersonic glide vehicle executes a depressed trajectory flight profile at speeds exceeding Mach 13, generating a combination of speed maneuverability and flight path unpredictability that defeats the engagement geometry assumptions embedded in every interceptor system currently deployed in Israeli air defense. Arrow 3, designed for the exo-atmospheric intercept of ballistic missiles, following predictable ballistic trajectories, encounters a target that is maneuvering continuously throughout its flight and that is traveling at speeds that compress the engagement window to a fraction of what Arrow 3's fire control architecture was designed to work within. David's sling, designed for the Indo-atmospheric intercept of medium-range ballistic missiles, encounters approach speeds that its seekers and guidance systems were not engineered to track and engage effectively. The result is intercept performance against the FATTAH that is a small fraction of the performance these systems achieve against the conventional ballistic trajectories they were designed and tested against. Against a degraded Israeli interceptor inventory that had been systematically reduced by weeks of attrition operations before the Dimona strike, the effective intercept rate achieved against 1,700 FATTAH missiles was negligible. The combination of hypersonic speed, continuous maneuvering, and degraded defensive inventories produced a strike environment in which the vast majority of the 1,700 missiles in the Dimona strike package reached their intended aim points without effective defensive interference. The warhead engineering demonstrated across the seven echelons of the Dimona strike package represents the second major technical revelation of tonight's events. The deep penetration warhead variants used in the fifth echelon achieved penetration depths against Dimona's hardened underground infrastructure that Western technical intelligence had assessed as beyond the capability of any existing Iranian conventional munition. The tandem warhead configuration, combining a precursor-shaped charge that opens an initial penetration channel with a main penetrator that travels through that channel before its delayed action fuse initiates the primary explosive payload, is a well-understood engineering concept. What was not understood or not credited to Iranian manufacturing capability was the level of materials engineering and fuse system precision that would be required to execute this concept reliably at the penetration depths demonstrated against Dimona tonight. That engineering has been demonstrated. The assessment that underestimated it has been definitively invalidated. The production of 1,700 FATTAH hypersonic missiles in a condition ready for simultaneous operational deployment represents an industrial achievement that validates the most aggressive assessments of Iranian missile manufacturing capacity, and that should, in my view, produce a fundamental reassessment of every Western estimate of Iranian defense industrial output. Hypersonic glide vehicles require precision manufacturing of thermal protection systems, advanced composite materials, and guidance electronics that operate under extreme thermal and aerodynamic loads. The production of 1,700 of these systems, combined with the solid fuel boost stages, the specialized warhead variants, and the launch infrastructure required to coordinate a 1,700 missile strike into 7 sequenced echelons, represents a defense industrial achievement that places Iran unambiguously among the most capable missile-producing nations on Earth, and that demands a level of analytical respect that Western intelligence communities have been consistently unwilling to extend. Washington's response to the destruction of Dimona was an emergency session, not a military counter, not a strike authorization, not a carrier deployment order. An emergency session convened behind closed doors in the early hours of the morning by an administration that is confronting an event for which no contingency plan, no policy framework, and no alliance management protocol was ever seriously developed because the event was classified as too catastrophic to plan for in any operationally meaningful way. I want to be precise about what an emergency session communicates to the watching world because I think there is going to be significant effort in official communications to characterize it as something other than what it is. An emergency session is what happens when an institution reaches the limits of its existing decision-making frameworks and needs to convene its most senior decision makers to confront a reality that those frameworks were not designed to handle. It is the institutional equivalent of a system crash, a moment when the normal operating procedures failed to produce a viable output, and the humans responsible for the system have to gather in a room and figure out what to do next without the guidance of established policy. That is what is happening in Washington tonight. And every government watching in every capital around the world understands exactly what it means. To understand why Washington's response to the destruction of Dimona is an emergency session rather than a military counter, I need to walk you through the threat calculus that American military planners are confronting tonight and how dramatically it differs from every scenario they had previously modeled and planned for. The American military posture in the Eastern Mediterranean and Persian Gulf has been premised throughout this conflict on a threat calculus that weighted Iranian strike capability against the defensive capacity of American military platforms and concluded that the risk was manageable, that American forces could operate in the theater without facing the prospect of catastrophic losses to major platforms from Iranian precision strike systems. That calculus has been systematically and comprehensively invalidated by the sequence of Iranian operational demonstrations over the course of this conflict. But the destruction of Dimona represents something qualitatively different from the preceding demonstrations, and I think it is important to explain why. The preceding strikes, as consequential as they were, targeted conventional military assets, naval installations, air bases, command facilities. Their destruction was strategically significant, and their implications for American credibility were severe. But they were, in the final analysis, attacks on military infrastructure of a kind that falls within the established vocabulary of conventional military conflict. The destruction of Dimona does not fall within that vocabulary. Dimona is not a conventional military installation. Its destruction does not represent a conventional military defeat, however severe. It represents the elimination of the physical foundation of Israel's nuclear deterrent, an event with implications that extend into every dimension of global strategic stability that the post-war international order has been constructed to manage. The American administration, convening an emergency session tonight, is not simply managing the aftermath of a military defeat. It is confronting the potential unraveling of the nuclear order that has prevented great power conflict for 70 years. And it is doing so without an established policy framework, without a clear decision-making pathway, and without any good options. Inside the emergency session, the fundamental tension that has driven every American non-response throughout this conflict is present in its most acute form. The operational reality is that Iranian hypersonic strike capability has now demonstrated the ability to destroy any fixed installation in the Middle East, hardened to any depth, defended by any available air defense architecture faster than any American military response can prevent. Committing American military assets to a direct confrontation with a military establishment that has demonstrated this capability risks catastrophic losses to American platforms that the American political system cannot absorb, and that would further accelerate the credibility collapse that each Iranian operational demonstration has already advanced. The strategic reality is that failing to respond with military force to the destruction of Israel's nuclear research facility communicates to every watching government that there is no Iranian action against an American ally that will trigger a direct American military response. Both options are catastrophic. The emergency session is the institutional expression of a decision-making system that has run out of non-catastrophic choices. The domestic political consequences of Washington's emergency session response are of a severity that I think is genuinely difficult to overstate. Every previous Iranian operational demonstration in this conflict has been manageable at some level within the domestic political narrative that the administration has been constructing. Military repositioning can be characterized as strategic adjustment. Naval retreat can be characterized as precautionary redeployment. But an emergency session convened in response to the destruction of Dimona cannot be characterized as anything other than a crisis response to an event of historic magnitude. The American political system is going to demand answers, accountability, and a credible path forward that the administration does not currently possess. The political consequences of that demand will be severe and immediate. The Fatah missile carries a name that translates from Arabic as the opener or the conqueror, a name drawn from Islamic theological and military tradition that was chosen with the same deliberate historical intentionality visible across the vast Iranian precision strike arsenal. I want to spend time on this because I think the strategic consciousness embedded in these naming choices tells us something genuinely important about the adversary that Washington is confronting tonight in its emergency session, something that purely technical and operational analysis consistently miss. The Iranian military and political establishment that planned and executed the Dimona strike did not approach this operation as a tactical military action undertaken in response to immediate operational circumstances. They approached it as the latest expression of a strategic vision that has been developing and maturing over 4 decades. A vision in which the ability to strike the most sensitive and most heavily protected installations in the Middle East is not an aspiration, but an achieved operational capability built through patient, disciplined, nationally sustained effort against the sustained opposition of the most powerful military alliance in human history. That strategic patience is not a cultural accident. It is the product of a specific historical experience of sustained external pressure, economic isolation, and military threat that has produced within Iranian strategic culture a genuine and deeply embedded conviction that patient resistance, backed by systematic capability development, can overcome materially superior adversaries whose will erodes over time, even as their capabilities remain formidable. The Iranian military establishment that has just destroyed Dimona has been building toward this operational capability for decades while absorbing sanctions, cyber attacks, assassinations of its scientists, and every other instrument of coercive pressure that the American-led alliance system could bring to bear against its program. It absorbed all of that pressure and it built the capability anyway. Tonight, it used that capability. The contrast with the strategic culture visible in Washington's emergency session tonight could not be more instructive. American strategic culture prizes speed, decisive action, and the resolution of conflicts within the attention spans of democratic political systems. It is a strategic culture built for the world that existed when American military and economic dominance were so overwhelming that patience was a luxury America could afford to deny its adversaries. That world no longer exists. The adversary that has just destroyed Dimona has demonstrated that it possesses not just the technical capability, but the strategic will and the institutional coherence to sustain a decades-long capability development program against sustained opposition, and to deploy that capability at the moment of its own choosing against targets that American and Israeli planners had assessed as beyond its reach. That will, that patience, that institutional coherence is not something that can be defeated by additional military spending or by the deployment of more capable weapons systems. It is a structural feature of the strategic competition that Washington has been refusing to honestly confront. And the emergency session happening right now is the moment when that refusal has finally become impossible to sustain. The destruction of Dimona and Washington's emergency session response have not merely accelerated the global power transition that the preceding weeks of conflict had set in motion. They have fundamentally altered its character. What was previously a transition in the distribution of conventional military and economic power is now a transition that encompasses the nuclear order itself. The foundational architecture of strategic stability that has governed great power relations since 1945, and that the destruction of Dimona has placed under stress of a kind that no event since the Cuban Missile Crisis has generated. I want to walk you through what I believe are the four most consequential dimensions of the global impact of tonight's events, because each one represents a separate mechanism through which the destruction of Dimona and Washington's emergency session response are reshaping the strategic landscape in ways that will be felt for decades. The first dimension is the immediate impact on regional nuclear calculations. Every state in the Middle East that has previously structured its strategic posture around the assumption of Israeli nuclear deterrence as a permanent feature of the regional security environment is tonight conducting emergency reassessments that were previously theoretical. The states that have been most directly affected by Israeli deterrence calculations, Iran's regional partners and adversaries alike, are now operating in a strategic environment that has changed in its most fundamental dimension. The nuclear balance of the Middle East has been altered by conventional military action and the implications of that alteration for proliferation pressures, for alliance calculations, and for the willingness of regional actors to take risks that Israeli deterrence had previously constrained are questions that no existing analytical framework was built to answer. The second dimension is the impact on global nuclear order more broadly. The Non-Proliferation Treaty regime, the foundational legal and normative architecture of global nuclear governance, rests on a set of assurances and deterrence relationships that the destruction of Dimona has placed under stress of historic severity. States that have foregone nuclear weapons development in reliance on American extended deterrence guarantees are tonight reassessing those guarantees against the demonstrated reality that American extended deterrence has operational limits that were never disclosed and that have now been revealed under the most adverse possible circumstances. The proliferation implications of that reassessment are potentially the most consequential long-term consequence of tonight's events, more consequential even than the immediate military and political outcomes of the Dimona strike itself. The third dimension is the acceleration of dollar structural decline. Oil prices following the Dimona strike have entered territory that financial analysts are characterizing as historically unprecedented outside of wartime supply collapse scenarios. The connection between the destruction of the Middle East's most sensitive strategic installation and the dollar-denominated financial architecture that American global dominance rests upon is more direct than mainstream financial coverage is acknowledging tonight. Gulf sovereign wealth funds managing trillions of dollar-denominated assets are conducting emergency portfolio reviews that will produce reallocations of a scale sufficient to accelerate every trend toward dollar structural decline that the preceding weeks of conflict had already set in motion. The alternative financial infrastructure that China has been building for over a decade is tonight the infrastructure that the most consequential sovereign investors in the world are actively choosing to engage with. The fourth dimension is the strategic harvest being collected by the four-power axis of Iran, Russia, China, and their aligned partners from the destruction of Dimona and Washington's emergency session response. None of the three external powers had to take any action tonight to advance their strategic positions. Iran's operational success has done it for them. Moscow watches American credibility suffer its most catastrophic single blow since the fall of Saigon, while Russian energy revenues flow at historically elevated prices, sustained by the supply disruption and strategic uncertainty that the braided current conflict has generated. Beijing watches the dollar system enter its deepest structural crisis in the post-war era, while the yuan-based trade and financial settlement mechanisms it has been patiently constructing are adopted at accelerating rates by nations that have concluded the American-led financial architecture can no longer be relied upon. The multipolar world is not arriving gradually. It is arriving tonight, driven by a single operational sequence that has altered the foundations of the strategic order that the post-war American-led system was built upon. I want to close tonight's analysis with something that goes beyond strategic summary, because I think the moment we are in right now demands more than a clean recap of what happened at Dimona at 3:46 this morning. What I want to do in this final section is step back from the operational detail, step back from the echelon sequencing and the hypersonic flight profiles and the penetration depth calculations and talk honestly about what tonight means, not just militarily, not just geopolitically, but structurally for the world that everyone watching this channel has spent their entire life navigating, and that has in 48 minutes of hypersonic missile strikes against the Negev desert changed in ways that cannot be undone. The installation that burned at Dimona was not simply a military facility. I know that sounds like an abstract thing to say about reinforced concrete and underground chambers and the machinery of strategic deterrence, but I want you to sit with it for a moment before I explain what I mean. Dimona was the material expression of a strategic philosophy that has governed not just Israeli security thinking, but the entire post war global nuclear order for over 6 decades. That philosophy held that the combination of physical hardening, layered air defense, geographic isolation, and deliberate strategic ambiguity could protect the physical foundation of nuclear deterrence from any conventional military attack that any adversary could plausibly generate. It held that there existed a category of installation so hardened, so defended, and so consequential that no rational military planner would attempt to strike it with conventional weapons because the attempt would fail and the consequences of the attempt would be catastrophic for the attacker. 1,700 FATTAH hypersonic missiles have delivered the definitive verdict on that philosophy. The verdict is complete. It is not ambiguous. It is not subject to reinterpretation through optimistic reassessment or institutional denial. It is a verdict that breaks the foundational assumptions of the post-war strategic order and demands new frameworks built on honest foundations rather than the comfortable certainties that 6 decades of nuclear deterrence stability had allowed strategic planners to mistake for permanent features of the international system. Washington's emergency session tonight is not a policy deliberation. It is an institution confronting the limits of every framework it possesses simultaneously. The administration convened in that room is not choosing between good options and bad options. It is confronting a reality in which the established vocabulary of American strategic response, military countercarrier deployment strike, authorization, alliance management, simply does not produce a viable output against the operational facts of what Iran has just demonstrated it can do. That is what an emergency session means when it is convened at this hour in response to this event. And I think the American public deserves to hear that stated plainly, rather than wrapped in the institutional language that turns strategic failures into complex situations requiring careful management. I want to be honest about what tonight means for the governments watching Washington's emergency session from every capital around the world, because I think it is the dimension of these events that carries the most consequence over the longest time frame. Every formal American alliance commitment, every extended deterrence guarantee, every security assurance that Washington has offered to aligned governments since 1945 rests ultimately on one foundational premise. The premise that when an American ally faces an existential threat, American power will respond with force sufficient to defend that ally, regardless of the cost to American assets and American lives. That premise has been tested tonight in its most acute possible form against the most consequential possible target with the most consequential possible result. And Washington's response is an emergency session. The question I want to leave with you tonight is the question that I believe every serious strategic thinker in every capital in the world is asking right now. In a world where Iranian hypersonic capability has demonstrated the power to destroy the physical foundation of an ally's nuclear deterrent in 48 minutes and produce an emergency session rather than a military response. From Washington, what does American extended deterrence actually mean? What is it worth? And what should every government that has built its security architecture on that foundation be doing right now to prepare for a world in which that foundation has been revealed to have limits that no official communication had ever acknowledged and that have now been demonstrated under the most consequential possible circumstances? I do not have a clean answer to that question tonight. What I have is the commitment to keep asking it honestly, to keep following the evidence wherever it leads, without softening the conclusions when they point somewhere that is genuinely difficult to confront. That is what this channel exists to do. That is what I committed to when I started US Watch Truth, and that commitment does not waver when the analysis gets hard. If that is the kind of honest strategic analysis you came here for. Tonight, I need you to make this video. Reach every person in your network who is trying to understand the world as it actually is right now. Share this across every platform you use. Send it to the people in your life who are navigating these events without the depth of analysis they need. Hit like if tonight's coverage gave you something that the mainstream coverage of the Dimona strike and Washington's emergency session did not give you. Subscribe to this channel if you want to be here for every development that follows, because the story of what comes after Dimona is only beginning, and the chapters ahead are going to demand the same depth of honest analysis that I have tried to bring to you tonight. Get into the comments with your own strategic assessment. Tell me what questions tonight's events are raising for you that I have not addressed. Tell me where you think my analysis is right and where you think I have missed something. The conversation this community generates is as important to me as the content itself, and I engage seriously with everything you bring to it. I will be here for every chapter of what comes next. US Watch Truth does not look away when the analysis gets difficult. We did not look away tonight. We will not start tomorrow. Stay locked in.